So earlier this year, I decided to be brave and I deflasked my very first batch of orchids. 6 months on, they're still really happy and healthy and maturing well, and it's almost time for them to be transitioned outside for the very first time. In today's video, I'd love to talk to you about what I've learned in regards to the whole deflasking process, the materials that I use and how I care for them week by week, and also just show you their amazing progress that they've made in their very first 6 months. So to start us off, I'd love to go over the basics of orchid propagation because there's a variety of ways in which they can be propagated. The first of which is forming what we call keikis. Thank you to one of my lovely subscribers who actually let me know how to pronounce it because I used to say kiki, but apparently it is keiki. So orchids like Phalaenopsis, dendrobiums, vandas, and epidendrums can all grow keikis, and it's basically a baby plant that can form either on a flower spike in the case of something like a Phalaenopsis, or at the base of a plant known as a basal keiki. And essentially a keiki is just a baby orchid that can be separated from the mother plant eventually once it's grown its own root system. You can also propagate some orchids through the process of division. This can be done on orchids that have what's called a sympodial growth habit. So basically they have a horizontal stem that's also called a rhizome, from which multiple leafy growths or pseudobulbs emerge. And this can happen in orchid types like also dendrobiums, again, who can also have keikis, but orchids like dendrobiums, cattleyas, oncidiums, and cymbidiums, just to name a few different types. And when you're dividing these types of orchids, they should have at least one pseudobulb with a new growth that has healthy roots of its own in order for it to be sustainable and to continue to grow. And then of course, other methods include growing the orchids from seed or from tissue culture. So in order to get seeds to form, they're created through a process of pollination, fertilization, and maturation that all occurs inside a seed pod. And this process can happen naturally via insects, or it can be done by hand, where pollen from one flower is transferred to another flower. After pollination occurs, the flower itself will wilt, and the ovary at the base of the flower will begin to swell and mature and form a seed pod or a seed capsule over the next few months. And inside this, the fertilized, what they call ovules, will continue to develop and form into thousands and thousands of dust-like particles, which are seeds, which will eventually be released into the environment when the seed pod splits open. And in nature, once they're released, these seeds are actually quite unique because they've got no food reserves and they rely solely on a symbiotic relationship with a fungus in order to germinate and grow. Whereas in a lab, what they'll do is they'll sterilize the seed pod in a bleach-like solution from what I could find online before then the seeds can be harvested. Then they'll create a jelly-like solution called agar, which acts as the orchid's food source. And things like activated charcoal can also be added within the agar to absorb toxins, and they'll adjust the pH accordingly. The agar will then be sterilized by autoclaving, and the seeds will be sewn into the agar and placed into what's called a flask. And the container or flask is then sealed to allow then the orchids to germinate and grow into what are called protocorms, which are small like bulbous structures. And over time, these little protocorms will develop roots and leaves and develop into little seedlings. And sometimes this can take a few weeks, I believe. Sometimes it can take months or even longer, purely depending on what type of orchid the seeds are from. In terms of knowing when is the best time to then deflask the orchids once they have developed, there's a couple of key things that you should be looking out for. The first of which would be root development. So you should look for strong, healthy roots that are starting to grow vigorously inside the flask. The second thing to check for is leaf and stem growth. So the baby orchids inside the flask should have a couple of leaves or quite a few leaves and a healthy stem. And some hybrids might have either a new pseudobulb or a new growth, which is a really good sign of maturity and can be a sign that they're ready to be deflasked. The third thing I'd take into consideration is the plant size as well. So you want them to be large enough that they'll be handleable. You don't want them to still be tiny, tiny little microscopic organisms that when you take them out, they're just going to break in your hand or fall apart. But you also don't want to wait for them to be so old that they're starting to brown or their original growth is starting to die. So big enough that when you take them out, you'll be able to fit it in your hands and clean it and touch it without harming it, but not so big that they're really, really tightly squished in there and you're going to actually damage them when you take them out because they're so big, or that they're already starting to show signs of browning. The last thing I'd consider is the season or the time of year that you're going to be deflasking. I read online a couple of different things. Some people say you can deflask at any time of year. Other people say just be sort of careful that you're not deflasking in really extreme temperatures, like extreme heat or extreme cold. So personally, I mean, I haven't had too much experience, but I would say early autumn and early spring are the two best times to deflask. You kind of want to aim for a time where temperatures are fairly consistent and a little bit warmer, say between about 18 and 25 degrees consistently for them. So as I said, I've never deflasked orchids before, so most of my information was based on the plant propagator on YouTube. If you haven't checked out his channel, it is amazing. He is so knowledgeable. So massive shout out to him, and thank you so much for teaching me how to deflask orchids. He's got a really high success rate as well with his deflasking. I think in one of his videos he said over 90% or something, which is fantastic, because you hear from a lot of people that don't deflask orchids. It's so hard, they die all the time, and so far so good for me, so touch wood. Thank you, plant propagator, it's much appreciated. And I'll continue to update you guys on how they're doing. So hopefully once I do transition them outside, I can keep them maturing and get them to flowering size, but I will let you know. But yes, so far so good. One of the other reasons I also decided to do my very first deflasking is on eBay we actually came across the flask that we bought, and it is Dendrobium samurai cross antenatum. And the Dendrobium samurai, as far as I've seen, you can't really get it in Australia, but because flasks are sterile, they can actually be imported from overseas because they're sterile, they're clean, there's no bugs in there. That's pretty much the only way, or one of the only ways, you can bring orchids into the country. So I was very excited to see the Dendrobium samurai flask, and I love antenatum as well. I don't actually have an antenatum. I was supposed to have an antenatum, but it turned out to be something different. And the samurai and antenatum are spatulata type dendrobiums, which is basically just a class within the dendrobium type. They're also kind of known as antelope orchids because they have little like horn looking flowers. They're really cute. Google it if you don't know what I'm talking about. But yes, we came across that flask and I ummed and ahed and said to my husband, do we try it? And he really wanted to try deflasking as well. So we thought we'll get it and try our very best to grow them. So before you do your deflasking, you definitely need to make sure you have all the materials and you're ready to go and set up, because once they're out of the flask, you want to move fairly quickly because you don't want them to dry out. They're only babies. So we went to Bunnings and bought little seedling pots. And the pots I found work best for it is if you get really tall and square seedling pots. Being tall and square really helps to optimize space as well for when you put them in the containers like you can see behind me. Because within a flask, there might be anywhere from 30 to 100 or more orchids in there. So you want to try and maximize space. So if you're tall, skinny, square, you're going to be able to put more orchids within one container, which will overall take up less room in your house. So that's a plus. We love that. And I did this when I was back in the apartment and had a lot less space. So space optimization was high on the list for me. You'll also want to get a bunch of large clear containers like you can see behind me, or I'll show you the video I took at the time. These ones we also just got from Bunnings, I believe, but since then we've done a little bit more deflasking, which I will talk to you about, and we ended up getting some containers from Amazon as well. But supermarket containers, Bunnings, hardware store, online, anything you can find. You basically just want a container that's going to fit as many of those seedling pots as possible, and ideally one that has a lid as well to help boost humidity, because the baby orchids have just come out of their flask where it's been really nice and sterile and a humid environment to the outside world. So you want to keep them as humid as possible so they can continue to take up as much moisture as possible and be nice and warm and humid to promote growth. And of course you'll also need some potting medium. So I just used orchid bark, the tiniest orchid bark that I could find, and a good quality one if you can find one and if it's not too expensive. And the reason that you want really small bark is the orchids, as I said, are just little tiny babies, and their roots are little baby roots as well. And it also helps to keep it a little bit more moisture retentive while they're growing their first sort of roots. They don't need as chunky a medium as a more mature plant would. Okay, so now the actual process of the deflasking. So to start with, you're going to soak your orchid bark. So you'll need some sort of container to soak it in. The container I used was, I can't remember exactly what it's called. If I remember, I'll put it on the screen, but just something large enough that you can put the bark in and soak it to sterilize it as much as possible. Because it is bark, obviously you're not going to be able to completely sterilize it, but doing this basically just helps to remove any bugs, anything sitting on the bark or fungus or anything yucky that you don't want to touch your babies, because they'll be the most susceptible to rotting or harm or fungus or pests as soon as they come out of the flask, because they've just left their sterile environment. So sterilize the bark as much as possible, soak it for 10 minutes. I just gave it a good stir to make sure it was nice and evenly coated. Then once it's been sat there for about 10-15 minutes, you want to drain all the water out and allow the bark to cool before you do your deflasking. You don't want to drain it and then immediately start potting up the orchids, because the bark is hot. And when I say it's hot, it's just been in boiling water. So don't burn yourself either. Drain it and allow it to cool for a couple of minutes before you start your deflasking process. Now we start to get towards the more exciting bit, and you're going to remove the lid of your flask and submerge it in water. So I had 2 of these black containers, so the second one I just filled with lukewarm water, nothing fancy, and submerged my whole flask in water. And then it will sort of depend on what kind of flask you have. If you have a plastic flask, you could probably, I'd imagine, just cut the top sort of, or the side out of the flask and remove the orchids that way, or just cut sort of around the neck of the bottle and then you could probably remove the orchids. But if you're like me and your flask is glass, you're probably going to have to smash it. And please, please, please be very careful when you smash it. I didn't smash it myself. I was too scared that I was going to hurt myself or hurt the orchids or hurt someone. So we had family staying with us at the time, and it was actually my father-in-law that got the honor of smashing the first flask. So yes, he got a hammer, held it with one end with a tea towel and smashed the bottom end. And then you could sort of from there loosen all the orchids out of the flask and then remove them. And from there you want to start separating all of the orchids out and removing and rinsing the agar off of all the roots. So we kind of separated them all out, rinsed them under the tap to remove all the agar, and then I sat each of them in a bowl filled with distilled water. And sitting them soaking in water was basically so that they didn't dry out, because it was quite a time-consuming process, more so than I thought, to separate all the orchids out individually. They were really vigorous within that flask, as you probably saw. There were growths everywhere, leaves everywhere, and roots absolutely everywhere. And because they are growing on top of each other, of course, they were all tangled, so it took quite a lot of time to get them all separated. So just pop them in a little bowl of water. It's not going to hurt them because they've been living in so much moisture anyway. That's what they're kind of used to at this point. So don't be too worried about soaking them, but obviously don't leave them overnight or anything. I can't imagine that would be good, but an hour or so while you're separating them all out and removing the agar off their roots, totally fine. The next step is literally just potting them up into their little seedling pots. So the seedling pots that I told you I got, they were quite tall. We ended up cutting them so that they weren't as tall, because we knew, being dendrobiums, they will eventually grow, hopefully they'll eventually get growth that are quite tall, and we didn't want them to be hitting the top of the lid. So yeah, we cut them and then placed sort of some bark in there, popped the orchid in, and then, as you normally would, backfilled with the rest of the little baby bark that we were using. And that took probably about an hour or 2 to get them all done. And by the end of it, we had about 40 or 45 orchids. Once they were all potted in position, we sprayed them with a weak dose of fungicide. And this will basically help to protect them from fungal infections and things like soft rot, because they're particularly vulnerable due to the stress of being deflasked and also just the change in their growing environment. I can't remember exactly what dose we used of the fungicide, but whatever dose it says on the bottle or the packet, whatever you're using and mixing it up with, just use maybe half of that dose or even a quarter of that dose. I just kind of guess. If you know, then do what you know. But I think it's better to be safe, because the orchids are still such babies, they're not mature yet. To just use a slightly lower dose than what you normally would. It will just hopefully be enough to keep them nice and safe, keep rot and fungus and everything away while they're in their first few stages of development. Where is it? I'll find you what we actually used to water with. Aha, I found one. I can't remember exactly where this is from either, but I will put it on the screen if I find out. This little bottle here was super handy. Definitely, if you're doing some deflasking, get one of these little ones, because it's got its nice little tip on it, which means you can spray over the flask and really direct where you're putting the water as well, rather than just tipping in a big sort of watering can full of water. It also means that you're tipping less water at a time. So you're not going to tip water onto the deflasked orchids and it's going to uproot them out of their pot because they're still obviously not settled in there. So these are fantastic. So we filled this with distilled water and gave it a good soaking all over the leaves, all over the roots, all over the medium, everywhere. You don't have to worry at this stage about them being wet in the crown, which is the space between the top two leaves that can sort of hold water. If you know orchids, or if you haven't really done too much with orchids, I'll just get this one for you. This is a Phalaenopsis, so a different type of orchid, but the crown is at the top there. And when you're watering, you don't want to get water in the crown because it can lead to rot and it will rot the stem and the orchid will die. But because, as I said, the deflasked orchids were just in the flask, they're used to a more humid, more moisture retentive environment, it's totally fine to cover them with water. And when you're doing your watering, here's some of the babies that I'll show you close-ups of soon. At the moment they're dry, but when you water, you want to have maybe 1 centimeter or 0.5 centimeter, something like that, of water in the base at all times. It helps to boost humidity, particularly when you've got their lid on as well. Boost the humidity within there to encourage them to grow, and also allows them kind of a little bit of a water reservoir down the bottom as well, so that they don't dry out, which is really important, particularly in the first few months. And if it is quite cool, or it's like a cooler time of year when you are deflasking, I definitely recommend getting some seedling heat mats that I've got under here, just to help keep it a little bit warmer at all times for them, particularly if you're getting quite a cool down in the evenings. You don't want the babies to get cold. You want to try and protect them and keep them nice and cozy and warm and humid as much as possible. So heat mats are a really good idea. You can just get them online. That's probably the easiest way to source them. And you want to check on the babies at least once a week and thoroughly check them for things like pests or rot. And you also want to be changing their water every week. So I just went and got this for you. Look, this is a little makeshift thing that my husband and I made. It's literally a syringe with a bit of pipe on it. I don't even know where he got the pipe, but it's kind of a genius idea, because in order to remove the water and not have to like tip it out and risk tipping all the orchids out, we literally got this, put it down the bottom, and you can sort of suck up the excess water and, you know, get rid of it that way. And then once you've done that, you're going to get your little thing filled with distilled water and water them all again. And I just use sort of like a zigzag movement all over them, soaking their roots, each of the medium, making sure to get into each pot and allow there to still be a little reservoir of about 1 centimeter or a little bit at the base of the tray at all times. Yeah, and we did that every single week for many months, and it seemed to have done the trick, which is so exciting. And then we moved house. So in the move, we literally just taped the lids to the flasks and put them in boxes, stacked them in boxes, moved them, and then unpacked them straight away so that they didn't have too much of a change in their lighting conditions as well. Before we even unpacked any of the cutlery and everything, these shelves were unpacked and the lights were switched on, and the flasks and the heat mats, everything was put out, so that we hopefully didn't have any casualties, which so far so good. And as we sort of started to come out of winter and into spring, we decided to crack open the flasks. You can kind of see behind me, hopefully. We just left the lids kind of like half on, so it's not as warm and humid in there at all times, to start letting them dry out a little bit and be exposed just to the air inside. So they've probably been like that maybe 1.5 months, 2 months. And these ones, the dendrobiums, which are older, have had their lids off for almost a month now, I'd say, almost a month. So they're nearly ready to be transitioned. So I'll give you some close-ups now so you can see what the Dendrobium samurai cross antenatums are looking like at the moment. I think we've done really well. I don't know, please tell me in the comments below if you think this is a good turnout or if you think we could have done better. But a lot of them are getting really big and strong, healthy growths now that actually look like they're starting to mature. The leaves are nice and plump and firm. They're not looking like they're dehydrated. So far, we don't have any pests, so touch wood, we keep on that good trajectory. And the roots are really vigorous. Some of them are coming out the bases of the pot. They're filling their little seedling pots. And a lot of them are actually getting some more new growths now, which is so exciting. So yeah, please tell me if you think we're doing the wrong thing by looking to transition them outside soon. But I think that's kind of the logical next step. It's nice and warm here in Sydney now. We've got our shade house, as you hopefully saw in my last video. So they'll probably be moved out to the shade house and they'll be able to have a lot more airflow, more light, and it should be nice and warm out there going forward, which is so good. Now I will show you the other deflaskings that I have also done. So once we deflasked these dendrobiums and had a little bit of success, we were like, maybe we should try a few other species. So we've done 3 more flasks. We've done some Phalaenopsis flasks and some Catasetum flasks as well. Whoops, nearly dropped the lid. This one has a little bit of both in here, but you can see on the label, this is Phalaenopsis tetrapsis, and I think it is Tetrapsis purple. Yes, it is. So it's kind of a little bit of a different Tetrapsis, but these ones I think are also doing quite well. Let me show you some of the bigger ones. This one is actually, my goodness, they're growing quite a lot. So these ones, I'll put a little video of the flask so you can see what it looked like before we took them out. These ones we deflasked on the 7th of June. So it's now October. So it's been about 4 months. Yeah, 4 months. And they already look quite big. Look at that. Some of them were a little bit smaller when we deflasked them. I'll just show you some small ones. Some of them were like tiny, and we couldn't really separate them. So we ended up just putting a little clump together. But they actually look pretty good. And maybe it'll mean there's quite a few flower spikes when they eventually flower. Or they'll just get big enough, hopefully, that we can divide them again. Here's another one. This one has quite long leaves, but you can see that little white residue on there. That's just from like the fungal spray that we used. We did exactly the same process with these as we did the process I've just talked to you about with the dendrobiums. So nothing has changed. And then all these other flasks that you can see behind me at the bottom are all Catasetum flasks. So we got 2 different types of Catasetum flasks, both from Burrito Orchids. And this one is Catasetum Cheryl Erins SVO crossed with Catasetum Norm Tupper SVO Snow Leopard. And these ones are in slightly different pots. They're round pots. I think we just thought they'd do better with kind of shorter pots than the dendrobiums. These are also just Bunnings seedling pots that are really cheap. But they all have new growths, which is so exciting. I'm really happy with how they've gone. I'll just grab out this one to show you. There you go, but really healthy, strong roots, new growths, little root tips coming out, so cute. Oh, I'm so proud of all the little babies. It's so exciting. And this one is some of the other ones that we deflasked from the other Catasetum flask. This is also a Catasetum cross Catasetum. So Catasetum Grace Dunn Live Oak crossed with Catasetum tigrinum SVO2. Those ones. And in here, whoa, some of them be looking strong, very happy. So yeah, exactly the same conditions and deflasking process as the dendrobiums, and so far so good. The only other thing I've noticed about the Catasetum deflasking as compared to the other 2 is, boy, the Catasetums are thirsty babies. They drink so much water and they will drink it almost twice as quickly as the Phalaenopsis and the dendrobium deflaskings that we did. So really keep an eye on your Catasetum flasks. I think we were watering them at least twice a week, definitely more than once a week, because they just shoot out their roots and grow like crazy, which is great. You want them to be nice and vigorous. So that has been really good. Oh, I forgot to say how long the Catasetums have been out of their flask. Let me check. July. So about a month after we did the Phalaenopsis, we did these ones. So 3 months these ones have been out. So they're still not that old, these ones, but they're really vigorous. All of them have new growths. There were also quite a few, see if I can show you, that were just so tiny that you could barely even touch them without them falling apart. So I kind of like sat them on top of the pot. I think this was one of them. Yeah, so I kind of like just sat them on top of the bark and thought they'll probably die, but I feel terrible throwing them in the bin. And they're all shooting little new growths on there. So I mean, that seemed to work, which is really exciting. I know this video has been requested quite a few times, so hopefully it answered all of your questions. But if you've got any other questions, please pop them down in the comments below and let me know. As I said, this is my first time, or now first few times, deflasking orchids, so I'm no expert by any means, but I've definitely learned a lot along the way and have had some really good success so far. Let's hope that keeps happening. So I definitely recommend, if you haven't tried it before, get a flask, give it a go. It's very rewarding to be able to do something like this. And I just really wanted to learn a little bit more about how orchids are propagated and learn more about flasking and deflasking and growing orchids up from seedlings, because hopefully it will help me to become a more knowledgeable and a better grower as well. And I'll have some pretty little orchids that are new, and maybe ones that you can't necessarily get in Australia by the time that they're all grown up and flowering size. So win-win. Well, that's everything I've got for you today, guys. Please give me a like and press subscribe if you would like to see more of my orchid content, and leave a nice comment down below if you'd like to, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.